Hey guys, how's it going? We're here for yet another video lecture for AP World History. I'm Mr. Weber, your host. I have a jacket on, so I feel more hosty. But anyway, let's get down to it. Chapter 19, The Increasing Influence of Europe. Um, this goes along very well with the earlier chapter. The exact number of it's escaping me right now, but it basically picks up where it left off, obviously, because it's Europe. And it kind of leads us very closely to the Renaissance period in Europe. However, it doesn't quite get there. It kind of cuts off before the Black Plague hit Europe, and the book focuses more of the Black Plague as a Eurasian event, which in truth it is. I kind of like how it presents it in that way. But anyway, let's get to it. The increasing influence of Europe. I included on this, if it works, there we go, the learning objectives for this, just to sort of help you frame where this is going to go. But for historical argumentation, think of the Iberian Peninsula, that is the peninsula with Portugal and Spain on it. It could also be considered sort of the mesh point, one of the two mesh points in a way, where European Christendom meets the Dar al Islam, the world of Islam. So sort of see where that sort of becomes sort of the area where those two worlds meet. Um, Also see in terms of chronological reasoning how governments in medieval Western Europe were a result of cultural syncretism, where we see two different cultures sort of blend together, especially when you see sort of Roman styles of administration butt up against sort of Christian styles of administration, and also you have these sort of Northern European sort of barbaric, at least that's how the Romans saw them, styles of cultural elements as well. We'll also compare the economies of Western Europe with that of Byzantium, very similar to what we saw earlier. How the Christian church was able to reach throughout Europe and kind of conquer Europe in a sense. And then also we will analyze the significance of the crusade in terms of sort of starting this major technological and cultural diffusion, or transfer. Diffusion and transfer kind of mean the same thing. Think of diffusion like you would in a science class, like water will diffuse throughout a paper towel when it gets wet. Same thing with culture and technology. It diffuses across an area, especially when we're talking about Eurasia. I'll move myself up here. So, starting with the late Byzantine Empire, if you remember the theme system where they broke up the Byzantine Empire into manageable sections, and if you served well in the army or you proved yourself worthy to the empire, you could earn yourself an administrative role in this section. It starts to fall apart by the 11th century. Basically, what happened is that wealthy landowners gobbled it up, and we see this sort of polarization of wealth. Whereas before you had this nice solid middle class of Byzantine citizens, they consider themselves Roman citizens, but that middle class shrinks as the wealthy sort of control a massive part of the country. So you see a few control a big part of the nation state. And be on the lookout, because when that happens, usually bad things happen, because you have a few people that have everything and you have a lot of people that have nothing. And that's bad, not only because those lot of people that have nothing get really angry, but also it's just bad for the government, because guess what? Those rich people usually don't want to pay the share of taxes that have to be paid to keep a nation state that large going. They just don't want to do it because human nature, whatever you want to call it. So this starts to spell the end of the Byzantine Empire, as we shall see. And then they also had challenges from the West. Western European economies were growing more and more and more powerful, more and more potent. The Normans from Scandinavia were also pressing on Byzantine Empire's territories from the north, and the Crusades in the 12th and 13th centuries kind of began to spell the end of the Byzantine Empire, where Christian crusaders on their way to Jerusalem decided that, well, we can't really get to Jerusalem, but hey, Constantinople is there, so why don't we just rampage that and steal everything we possibly can? And they did in 1204. So much for this sort of Christian zeal and spirit, but we'll get to that in a bit later in the lecture. There's an image of the sack of Constantinople where you see Christians essentially attacking Christians, and the whole notion of a holy mission definitely gets completely thrown out the window, whichever way you slice it. We also see challenges from the east, and these would be the final undoings of the Byzantine Empire. Muslim Seljuk Turks basically invade Anatolia, which is the area that is now Turkey. And again, basically, they're just looking for what everybody else is looking for, food and riches. They defeat the Byzantine army in 1071 and create a sort of civil conflict, kind of a civil war, so to speak. And they just sort of steadily erode at the Byzantine Empire until the Ottoman Turks under Mehmed II, old onion head down there. Look at that big old onion. It's actually a turban and probably meant a lot to him. I should be more sensitive. Captures Constantinople in 1453, and the Ottoman Empire begins and would continue to exist until World War I. They renamed Constantinople Istanbul, and that's what we've been calling it ever since. If you ever go there, if you call it Constantinople, I'm sure you're going to get some weird looks from the Turkish people that live there. Maybe even worse than weird. But anyway, we're going to look at some of the regional states of medieval Europe, in particular the parts that constitute what we call now Western Europe. So this area of the Holy Roman Empire, which is basically parts of modern-day Germany, France, Switzerland, Austria, parts of the Czech Republic, and maybe even parts of Slovakia and Poland, but this big green lump there, as well as France, what is now Spain, which back then was basically three kingdoms actually, Castile, where the Castellan kind of language comes from, Aragon, Navarre, and then, of course, Portugal. And we'll talk a little bit about England, not too much in this chapter, and a decent amount about Scandinavia as well. So starting with the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire started as Otto I of Saxony, which is, I believe, kind of down here, took advantage of the Carolingian Empire, which was from France, which was sort of the last great attempt to sort of reestablish a sort of large empire in Western Europe in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire. Tried to establish a kingdom in northern Germany in the mid-10th century, and he had these various military attacks into Eastern Europe, and 2 times he entered Italy to aid the Roman Catholic Church so they could maintain their territories in Italy. For their efforts, Otto was named Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by Pope John the 12th. And fun fact, Otto, as you can see here, was made out of solid gold. And so was his horse. He was a solid gold man who rode a solid gold horse, whereas Pope John the 12th just looks like kind of a sad and lonely white man with a beard. But yeah, that's what they look like because that's the pictures I found of them. But anyway, I digress. Back to the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire thus began a sort of contentious relationship with the papacy in Rome. And that's kind of the theme you will see ongoing in the Middle Ages, where this whole conflict between who is in charge. Is it the local rulers or is it the Pope in Rome? Who should we listen to? The guy who can get us into heaven or the guy who is here that we actually have to deal with? And it's that conflict that we'll see happen over and over again. But Pope Gregory the seventh Gregory, tried to end this practice of lay investiture. What lay investiture is basically the practice of having regular people be officials within the church, like bishops and that sort of thing. To become a bishop, you have to go to a school known as a seminary, you have to take certain oaths, and you have to do the whole clergy thing, which is a pretty drawn-out process, and there's a lot of formality to it. They just wanted to be able to appoint people to various church positions, somewhat similar to what the Eastern Orthodox Church of Caesaropapism, which basically the ruler rules over papal decisions, and they can decide who is in charge. But the Pope didn't want to have that happen because basically he wants to maintain control. It's very much a political thing maintained by a religious entity, and he excommunicated Emperor Henry IX. Excommunicated basically means he is cut out of the Roman Catholic Church. In a way, it means like he can't go to heaven. He is totally removed from the Catholic faith. Some of you may think, how can a pope do that? Well, they did that somewhat frequently back in the Middle Ages. But German princes took it as an opportunity to rebel against the Holy Roman Empire, but that did not last that long. Basically to say, well, this guy's no longer in the church. He's not a man of God. He's got to go. And basically, Henry IX quickly put a stop to that. And then moving along to Frederick Barbarossa, aka Redbeard, that's literally what that means. He was another major emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, tried to absorb a part of northern Italy known as Lombardy. Popes did not want him to gain that much power. They're very much worried about having to contend with this Holy Roman Empire. So it was a sense of, well, we want them to support us, but we won't want them to grow too powerful that they can sort of replace us as the major power. And so Frederick, however, backed down a little bit. He sort of backed down and let the Pope kind of call the shots, which sort of gave to the maxim said by the French philosophe Voltaire that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And so they never really was in charge of anything. It wasn't that holy because they did things that weren't exactly that holy, like the whole investiture thing. And it's not really a Roman thing to do to say, okay, I'm going to let this person who is a couple countries away just tell me what to do. So it's not really holy, not really Roman, and it's not really an empire. So that moves us over to France, where we see sort of, and England, where we sort of see regional monarchies sort of take shape. The last Carolingian emperor was succeeded by a leader named Hugh Capet in 987, and he basically slowly expanded his authority out of Paris. And the only time somebody successfully invaded England happened in 1066 CE by a guy by the name of William the Conqueror. And he dominated the local people that lived in England, who were the Angles and the Saxons and other assorted Germanic groups. So we see this sort of synthesis of French and English culture kind of come together. And you still see that a little bit in British culture today. But realize that in places like France and England, and for the most part, most of Europe, the idea of a nation didn't really exist. You kind of just did whatever your local lord told you. The idea of a king of France didn't really resonate with most regular people living in Europe. You had your local leader, and that's really all you worried about. You had your local lord, and you were subservient to him. It was mostly always a him, and that was it. Okay. In fact, the practice of praying, which is showing submission to the Lord, kind of comes from this period, in that when you submit to your Lord, who would be the Lord of the manor, you put your hands like this to show that you are like handcuffed to this person, and they transferred that to showing subservience to the great God, Lord Almighty, that you're showing subservience. Before that, usually Christians prayed by doing this, like you were receiving sort of the grace of God and that sort of thing. And sometimes in church, you'll still see people do this in Christian churches. Moving now over to Italy, like I had mentioned previously in class, that Italy was not Italy as we know it. It was a bunch of small ecclesiastical states, city-states, and principalities. Ecclesiastical meaning like it has to do with the church. But it was a bunch of all small nation-states. The papal state directly controlled by the Pope was the biggest territory in central Italy. Well, one of the bigger territories in central Italy. Naples was bigger than that. By the 12th century, city-states gained more and more power and wealth that they kind of displaced the church as the main authority in northern Italy. And the Norman invasion in southern Italy and Muslim and Byzantine authorities were displaced. So Italy, just for the sake of purposes, basically a mess. Just a bunch of somewhat random city-states all kind of operating independently and almost always fighting each other with pretty good degrees of ferocity. And we'll see that happen over and over. Which brings us to Iberia. During this time, Iberia was going through a transformation from the 8th century to the 12th century and then on into the 13th and 14th centuries, and 15th centuries for that matter. From the 11th century on, there's just basically this slow reconquest, or reconquista as they call it, of Muslim territories. In the late 13th century, the Muslims only remained in the small area of Granada, and then in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Ferdinand and Isabella, two of the major monarchs of Spain, were able to push the Muslims out once and for all and reestablish the Iberian Peninsula as a Catholic area. And not just any Catholic area, but the Catholic area. And Spaniards would go to great lengths to prove how Catholic they and their territories were, which is why you see in Spanish Latin America still strong remnants of this Catholic sense. The Catholic Church is still very, very strong in Latin America, but we'll get to that when we see the Spanish conquest of that area. There we go. So going to the economy of Europe, just like in other places that we have seen previously, whether it be China, India, or wherever, the growth of agriculture results in the growth of the economy. The increased development of arable lands, arable meaning farmable, increase the amount of people you have, which improves your economy. It minimized the threat of invading nomads because now you have more people occupying the land and they can help function as a buffer against these sort of invading nomadic people, whether they be Vikings, Magyars, Muslim, whomever. And it cleared the swamps and forests and wildlife areas, which is not necessarily good for nature, but it is really good for feeding people. And other improved agricultural techniques helped aid that as well. The idea of crop rotation, where you sort of rotate your fields in terms of when you plant certain crops. You can't just grow the same crop on the same field year in, year out. That soil gets exhausted of its minerals and it no longer yields any food. You have to let the field rest, and you can plant certain crops to help the soil regain its minerals, but you can't do it. But they figured out how to do that, and they grew more crops, long story short. They grew new crops that were able to yield greater caloric amounts, or calories, so to speak, like beans, like this creepy little bean boy that we see here, as well as other innovations like horseshoes. Now horses' little hooves didn't get all splintered and messed up as they worked on the fields, as well as horse collars, which allowed you to harness a horse onto a plow without choking the horse. It basically put the weight on the horse's shoulder and midsection, and horses are faster than oxen, and they can basically plow a field more quickly. Excuse me. And as a result, population grew massively. We see between 800 and 1300 CE, in the period of 500 years, we see the population more than double. That's a huge amount of increase. It's a lot of mouths to feed, and it's a lot of people now all of a sudden you have to account for and help out. Cities grew and countries grew, and as with all this growth, there were a lot of changes. One of which was the revival of towns and trade. Now we start to have urban centers and specialization of jobs, where you have people moving to the city, and people can do things besides try to produce food. One of the key areas that labor was specialized was textile production. Textiles, basically anything made out of cloth. And it's this textile production that would be the first thing to be industrialized later in the Industrial Revolution. So remember that textile stuff, because that's a key continuity and change thing that you will see potentially on the AP exam. But with this specialization of labor, we see an increase of trade, and we see an increase in Mediterranean trade. And Italy, just like during Roman times, is uniquely positioned to have that advantage in terms of sea trade. They're right in the middle, so they can get to Spain, they can get to far parts of northern Africa, they can get to Palestine, and they can get to just about anywhere with relative ease. And they also can get to the Black Sea and be able to trade with all those Eastern European / Russian areas as well. So Italy becomes sort of the spot that's going to be able to trade. And because of that, they will be the first to experience the Renaissance as we knew it when we look ahead to chapter 21 and in the next unit as well. Moving up north, we haven't really talked too much about Scandinavians apart from Vikings, but Vikings and Scandinavians, they're not just people running around just raping and pillaging various coastal areas of England and Northern Europe. They also established a pretty extensive trading network called the Hansa Trading Network, which is basically a bunch of cities that traded with each other. And it was basically all these areas here, which now constitute Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia. So countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, as well as England as well. Basically traded all sorts of things. Engaged in various trade routes and were able to grow as societies did back then as well. And we see Europe really, really start to reemerge itself. A lot of people call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, but there was recovery, of course, at the end. You can't really have a renaissance or a rebirth without a recovery beforehand. And we see trade routes start to merge. We see these Hanseatic cities start to grow and become more and more of a force, if you will. And a lot of these are the major cities of Europe that still stand today. Cities like London, Cologne, Hamburg, which is one of the major cities in Germany, as well as Bergen up in Sweden. But with this came a degree of social change, and there was this attempt to oversimplify society back then, as people always are wont to do. They try to put things as simple and stark terms as they can, but they decided to break it up into three parts. Okay, three. Okay, we had those who pray, the clergy, considered to be the most important ones. We had those who fight, the knights, and those who work. The nobles would probably be considered under the those who fight part, but again, that's that whole oversimplification part. Who answers to who, and it was actually a big complicated mess because are you supposed to listen to the clergy? Are you supposed to listen to the knights? Who are you supposed to listen to? It was actually much more complicated than that because which noble do you listen to? Because nobles have to answer to other nobles, but do the nobles have to answer to the Pope, or does the Pope tell them what to do? It was a big mess, and it's going to lead to social conflict later on. But with all of these knights running around, basically, which were necessary before to defend you against marauders and all that sort of thing, you basically have these trained killers. And there was this legitimate worry back then with all of these well-armed people who are sort of geared to fight all the time. Well, with nobody to fight, what are they going to do? And this often led to unnecessary quarreling between these knights. So one way that was sort of subsided was this growing notion of chivalry, which was this code of conduct for nobles, especially knights. But it was sponsored by the church to sort of minimize fighting among Christians. It was this idea that we are a Christian area, so we shouldn't fight each other because Jesus didn't fight people. That's not the Christian thing to do. Technically, chivalry is a knight's dedication of his efforts to the promotion of Christianity, but it got extended to things like protecting women, protecting the weak and innocent, basically being more like a superhero than just sort of a bloodthirsty, murderous war machine, which a lot of knights were back then. In addition to this, there was also the growth of tournaments, sort of like when you go to medieval times, just like that, except they don't give you Pepsi and fried chicken. They probably just basically duked it out in some various sort of medieval skills tournament for knights so that they had something to do rather than just want to fight each other. Also, in terms of entertainment, so to speak, was this were musicians or troubadours, which is basically a class of traveling poets, minstrels, and entertainers who basically traveled around Europe and entertained people. They borrowed heavily from the Islamic traditions of love poetry, and as a result, they were really, 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 really popular with aristocratic ladies. ladies back in medieval times, just like now, just like forever, love the idea of love. A lot of guys do too, but it's always been very, very popular, and it was really popular among aristocratic women. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a major supporter and paid very, very handsomely to troubadours who could successfully entertain her and her court. But it was this popular idea of romantic love, sort of what we think of when we think of the Middle Ages, of princes and princesses and adventure that was rooted in love and fighting for Christianity, and this sort of refinement of European knights from being just bloodthirsty war machines to sophisticated, sensitive war machines. And independent cities were adding to this complication of those who work, those who pray, and those who fight. You now have these classes of merchants and artisans and physicians and lawyers, and some of these merchants gained fabulously wealthy, which challenged